Have you ever wondered what secrets are carried in the jaws of a war dog when no human is watching? What truth becomes so dangerous that only an animal, incapable of lies or allegiance to flags, can deliver it safely across enemy lines? Before we dive into one of the most chilling and classified incidents of World War II, I need you to do something for me. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. This story needs to reach people everywhere. Then hit that subscribe button, because this channel depends on your support to keep bringing these buried, forgotten truths to light. The powers that be don't want these stories told. Help me prove them wrong. The morning of December 17, 1944, arrived cold and merciless over the Ardennes forest. Staff Sergeant William Theodore Bachmann stood at the edge of a temporary Allied command post near the Belgian village of Malinois, watching the tree line with growing unease. The Battle of the Bulge had begun just one day prior, and already the carefully drawn maps of enemy positions seemed worthless. German forces had punched through American lines with a ferocity that suggested they knew exactly where to strike, exactly when defenses would be weakest, exactly which supply routes would be unguarded. Bachmann was not a frontline soldier. His specialty was signals intelligence, the interception and decryption of enemy communications. For 3 months, he had been embedded with the 106th Infantry Division, tasked with monitoring German radio traffic and identifying patterns that might reveal troop movements or strategic intentions. He was good at his job, perhaps too good, because he had begun to notice something that made his hands shake when he filed his daily reports. Someone was feeding information to the Germans, not rumors, not speculation. Precise, actionable intelligence that could only have come from within Allied command structures. Bachmann had tried to raise the alarm through proper channels. He had documented discrepancies, flagged suspicious timing of German counterattacks, compiled evidence of compromised operations. His reports had been received with polite acknowledgement and promptly buried. When he pressed harder, he was told in increasingly stern language to focus on his assigned duties and leave counterintelligence work to those trained for it. So he had stopped filing official reports. But he had not stopped investigating. The command post occupied a stone farmhouse that had been hastily fortified with sandbags and camouflage netting. Inside, a dozen officers clustered around maps and field telephones, their faces gray with exhaustion and worry. The German offensive had caught everyone off guard, but Bachmann knew it was not simply a matter of strategic surprise. The enemy had known too much, moved too precisely, struck too effectively at critical junctures. He had narrowed his list of suspects to 3 officers, all of whom had access to the intelligence summaries he prepared, all of whom had been present during planning sessions that preceded compromised operations. But he had no proof, nothing that would hold up under military justice, nothing that would overcome the institutional reluctance to believe that treason could exist at such levels. That was when he heard the dog barking. The sound came from the north, beyond the perimeter guards, a series of sharp, insistent vocalizations that cut through the pre-dawn stillness. Bachmann grabbed his rifle and moved toward the noise, his boots crunching through ice-crusted snow. Other soldiers were stirring, weapons raised, scanning the fog-shrouded forest for signs of a German patrol. But what emerged from the tree line was not a soldier. It was a Belgian Malinois, lean and muscular, its tan and black coat dusted with snow. The dog moved with purpose, not the panicked flight of an animal fleeing combat, but the deliberate gait of a creature on a mission. Blood matted the fur around its neck, and its sides heaved with exhaustion, but its eyes remained alert, focused, intelligent. Around its collar was a leather pouch, the kind used by messenger dogs to carry documents between units when radio silence was necessary or communication lines had been severed. Bachmann approached slowly, speaking in low, calming tones. The dog watched him with an intensity that felt almost human, as if weighing whether this particular soldier could be trusted. Then, with what seemed like a conscious decision, the animal sat and allowed Bachmann to reach for the pouch. Inside were 3 items. The first was a blood-stained map marked with German positions, artillery placements, and supply depots. The level of detail was extraordinary, the kind of intelligence that could save thousands of Allied lives if it was accurate, or lead thousands to their deaths if it was a deception. The second was a coded message written on a scrap of paper, torn from a German field manual. Bachmann had spent enough time breaking enemy ciphers to recognize the format. Though the specific code was unfamiliar to him, he would need time and reference materials to decrypt it. The third item made his blood run cold. It was a silver cigarette case, polished and expensive, engraved with initials that Bachmann recognized immediately. The case belonged to Major Edmund Garrett Pierce, one of the 3 officers on his list of suspects, a man responsible for coordinating intelligence distribution across multiple Allied divisions, a man who had been present at every planning session that preceded a compromised operation. But Pierce was not a German sympathizer or an ideological traitor. Bachmann had investigated his background thoroughly. The man was a decorated veteran, a graduate of West Point, from a military family with roots stretching back to the Revolutionary War. If Pierce was the leak, it was not because of loyalty to the enemy. It was because someone had leverage over him, or because he was being paid, or because he believed, for reasons Bachmann could not fathom, that betraying his country somehow served a greater good. The dog watched as Bachmann examined the cigarette case, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of what it represented. Then the animal did something that would haunt Bachmann for the rest of his life. It walked to the edge of the command post, looked back at him once, and released what it had been carrying in its mouth. Not carrying, clenching, holding with the desperate grip of an animal that understood the value of what it transported, even as its own life slipped away. The object fell into the snow with a soft thud. At first, Bachmann thought it was a piece of leather or a torn glove. Then he stepped closer and saw what it truly was: a human finger, severed at the second knuckle, still wearing a gold West Point class ring. The ring bore the year 1937. Major Edmund Garrett Pierce had graduated from West Point in 1937. Bachmann looked up, searching for the dog, but the animal was already gone, vanished back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Only paw prints in the snow proved it had been there at all, and even those were already being obscured by fresh snowfall. He stood there for a long moment, holding a dead man's finger, staring at intelligence that could change the course of the war, knowing that he had just been handed evidence of treason from the most unlikely of sources. A dog, a creature trained to carry messages, to traverse battlefields, to complete its mission regardless of cost. But trained by whom? And sent by whom? And how had it known to bring this evidence specifically to this command post at this precise moment, when Bachmann was the only person awake and alert enough to intercept it? He wrapped the finger in a handkerchief and secured it in his jacket pocket. The map and coded message went into his satchel. The cigarette case he held for a moment longer, studying the engraved initials, wondering what sequence of choices had led a decorated officer to betrayal, and what fate had befallen him in those final moments before his finger was delivered as evidence of his crimes. Bachmann had 2 options. He could take his findings to the commanding officer and risk having them dismissed or suppressed, as his previous reports had been. Or he could investigate further, follow the trail wherever it led, even if it meant operating outside official channels, even if it meant putting himself at risk. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the snow. In the distance, artillery rumbled, the sound of a battle that was consuming thousands of lives, while traitors undermined the effort from within. He made his decision. Bachmann returned to the farmhouse and gathered his encryption materials. He worked quickly, spreading the coded message on a table in a corner room, cross-referencing it against captured German code books, testing different cipher systems until patterns began to emerge. It took him 4 hours. 4 hours of near-constant work, ignoring the chaos unfolding around him as reports of German advances flooded in, as wounded soldiers were carried past, as officers shouted orders and frantically repositioned units on maps that were already obsolete. When he finally broke the code, his hands went numb. The message was not from Pierce to the Germans. It was from the Germans to Pierce. A confirmation of payment received, an acknowledgement of intelligence delivered, and a promise of extraction if Allied counterintelligence began closing in. But it was the signature at the bottom that made Bachmann's vision swim. The message was not signed by a German intelligence officer. It was signed by someone using an American code name, someone who clearly operated at a level far above Pierce, someone who was coordinating multiple traitors across multiple theaters of war. The code name was Shepard. Bachmann sat back, his mind racing. Pierce was not the apex of the conspiracy. He was a tool, a middle manager in a network that extended far beyond one compromised officer in one division. Shepard was running multiple agents, coordinating their intelligence, paying them through channels that somehow remained invisible to Allied counterintelligence. And now Pierce was dead, his finger delivered by a dog as proof of treason, but also as a warning. Someone had discovered Pierce's betrayal and executed him. Someone who wanted Allied command to know about the traitor in their midst. But who? Who had killed Pierce? Who had trained a war dog to deliver evidence? Who was operating in the shadows, hunting traitors while the official military bureaucracy remained blind or complicit? Bachmann began to understand that he was not dealing with a simple case of espionage. He was looking at two parallel operations, two hidden wars being waged beneath the surface of the conventional conflict. On one side, Shepard and a network of traitors selling Allied lives for money or leverage or ideology. On the other side, someone unnamed and unknown, someone with the resources to track traitors, execute them, and deliver evidence through channels that bypassed official structures entirely. He needed to find that dog. He needed to understand who had sent it, where it had come from, what other messages it might carry. Because if someone was hunting traitors outside the chain of command, Bachmann wanted to join them. He wanted to help them. He wanted to burn Shepard's network to the ground, no matter what it cost, no matter who tried to stop him. But first, he had to survive the Battle of the Bulge. And he had to do it while knowing that somewhere in the command structure above him, multiple officers were actively working to ensure Allied defeat. The dog's paw prints had already vanished under fresh snow, but Bachmann memorized the direction it had come from, the angle of its approach, the tree line it had emerged from. When the opportunity came, when the immediate crisis passed, he would follow that trail. He would find answers. He just did not know yet how many of those answers would lead him into darkness far deeper than anything he had imagined, or that the dog he sought was not simply a trained messenger, but the key to uncovering a conspiracy that reached all the way to Washington and beyond. That night, as artillery fire painted the horizon orange and screams echoed through the frozen forest, Bachmann lay in his bedroll and stared at the ceiling. Unable to sleep, he kept seeing the dog's eyes, that penetrating, almost human intelligence, kept feeling the weight of a severed finger in his pocket, kept wondering what Major Pierce's last moments had been like, when he realized his betrayal had been discovered, when he understood that the people he had sold his soul to would not protect him, that there would be no extraction, no escape, only a blade in the darkness, and a war dog carrying evidence of his crimes to the very soldiers he had betrayed. Somewhere in the night, beyond the perimeter, beyond the front lines, the Belgian Malinois was moving through enemy territory, carrying other messages, completing other missions, serving a master whose identity remained hidden even from the intelligence officers whose job it was to know such things. And Bachmann understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins, that finding that dog would require him to step outside every official protocol, every chain of command, every rule he had ever been taught to follow. It would require him to become, in essence, what he was hunting: a ghost, an operative who existed in the spaces between official records, someone who could move through the machinery of war without leaving fingerprints in the files. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cigarette case, opened it, found it empty except for a single slip of paper folded small and tucked into a corner. He had not noticed it before, had not thought to check for hidden compartments or concealed messages. The paper was fragile, the ink smudged, but the words were still legible. They were written in Pierce's handwriting, unmistakable, because Bachmann had studied dozens of the man's intelligence reports. But these words were not a report. They were a confession, or perhaps a warning. They read, in shaking script that suggested they had been written under extreme duress: "The shepherd has a shepherd. Find the Belgian. Trust the Belgian. It knows more than we do." Bachmann read the message 3 times, committing it to memory before burning it in the small heating stove that kept the farmhouse barely above freezing. The paper curled and blackened, taking Pierce's final words with it, but the meaning remained seared into Bachmann's consciousness. The shepherd has a shepherd. Shepherd was not the top of the pyramid. Someone else was pulling the strings, coordinating the coordinators, operating at a level so removed from the actual treachery that discovering their identity would require resources and authority Bachmann did not possess. Find the Belgian. Trust the Belgian. It knows more than we do. The dog was not simply a messenger. It was something more, something aware, something that understood the nature of the conspiracy in ways that humans, trapped in their assumptions and hierarchies, could not. Bachmann spent the next 72 hours doing his job while planning his investigation. The Battle of the Bulge raged around him, consuming men and machines in a frozen hell of artillery barrages and close-quarters combat. German forces continued their push westward, and with each passing hour, more evidence accumulated that they were receiving real-time intelligence on Allied positions and movements. He documented everything, every compromised operation, every suspiciously timed German attack, every intelligence summary that seemed to vanish into the bureaucratic void, only to reappear reflected in enemy action. He created a shadow archive, keeping duplicate records hidden in locations only he knew about, because he understood now that official channels were compromised at levels he could not yet identify. On the 4th day after the dog's appearance, Bachmann received new orders. He was being transferred to a signals intelligence unit operating out of Luxembourg City, effective immediately. The transfer came without explanation, without the usual administrative processing, without even a proper chain of custody for his classified materials. It was, he realized, an extraction. Someone had noticed his investigation. Someone wanted him away from the front lines, away from the evidence, away from whatever trail he had been following. He considered refusing the orders, going absent without leave, continuing his investigation independently. But that would make him a deserter, strip away his access to military resources, turn him into a fugitive. So he took a different approach. He accepted the transfer, packed his belongings, gathered his hidden archives, and arranged for them to be shipped to Luxembourg through unofficial channels that would keep them out of any inventory that his enemies might search. Before he left, he did one more thing. He returned to the spot where the dog had emerged from the forest, and he followed its tracks backward, into the trees, deeper into territory that was technically no man's land, where German and Allied forces had been trading control for days. The tracks led him 3 miles through dense forest, across frozen streams, past burned-out vehicles and scattered equipment from both armies. Several times, he had to take cover as patrols passed nearby. German voices calling out in the distance, the crack of rifle fire echoing through the trees. He found what he was looking for in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks. Someone had established a temporary camp there, carefully concealed beneath camouflage netting and natural cover. The camp was abandoned now, but signs of recent occupation remained. Boot prints, ration tins, a fire pit that had been expertly disguised but was still warm to the touch. And scattered around the perimeter, partially buried under snow, were dog collars. Not one or two, but dozens. Different sizes, different designs. Some bearing identification tags from American units, some from British units, some with no markings at all. Bachmann knelt and examined them, his mind working through the implications. Someone was running a network of messenger dogs, animals trained to carry intelligence across enemy lines, to infiltrate command posts, to deliver messages and retrieve information in ways that human spies could not. But this was not an official military operation. The Army had messenger dogs, of course, trained and deployed through proper channels. This was something else, something unauthorized, something invisible. He found one more thing before he left. Tucked under a rock near the fire pit, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a journal. The entries were written in English, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, the phrasing sometimes awkward, suggesting the author was not a native speaker. Bachmann did not have time to read the entire journal, but he skimmed enough entries to understand the outline of what he was looking at. The author was Belgian, a civilian who had been recruited by British intelligence in 1940 to run a network of informants in occupied territory. When the Germans had swept through Belgium, this person had gone underground, continuing to gather intelligence while officially listed as killed in action. The dogs had been the solution to the problem of communication. Animals could move through battlefields that would kill human couriers. They could be trained to recognize specific individuals, to deliver messages only to designated recipients, to avoid patrols and navigate terrain that changed daily as the front lines shifted. But somewhere in the process, this Belgian operative had discovered something that changed everything. They had uncovered evidence of Allied officers selling intelligence to the Germans. They had documented the network, identified the facilitators, traced payments back to their source. And they had realized that reporting their findings through official channels would accomplish nothing, because the conspiracy reached too high, protected itself too well. So they had taken matters into their own hands. They had begun hunting the traitors themselves, executing them in ways that looked like combat casualties, delivering evidence to junior officers who might still have the integrity to act on it. Officers like Bachmann. The final entry in the journal, dated 3 days before the dog had appeared at Bachmann's command post, was the most chilling. It read, "Pierce is compromised. Will terminate tonight. Evidence will be delivered to Signals Intelligence Unit, Malinois sector. Trust the American sergeant. He is asking the right questions. He will understand what must be done. Shepard's network must be dismantled before spring offensive. Time is running out. If this journal is found and I am not present to explain, know that I chose this path willingly. The dogs will continue the mission. They always do." Bachmann closed the journal and wrapped it carefully, securing it in his pack alongside the other evidence he had gathered. He was no longer dealing with a theory or a suspicion. He was holding proof of a parallel war, one fought by shadows against shadows, where the rules of military engagement did not apply, and the only loyalty that mattered was to the mission itself. He made his way back through the forest, reaching Allied lines just as darkness fell. The next morning, he boarded a transport truck to Luxembourg, his official records showing a routine reassignment, his hidden archives and the Belgian's journal safely concealed among his personal effects. Luxembourg City was chaos. Refugees crowded the streets, military convoys jammed the roads, and every available building had been converted into offices or barracks or hospitals. Bachmann's new assignment placed him in a former bank building where dozens of intelligence analysts worked around the clock, processing intercepted communications, tracking enemy movements, preparing summaries for senior commanders. It was, he quickly realized, the perfect place to continue his investigation. He had access to intelligence from across the entire theater of operations. He could cross-reference reports, identify patterns, build a comprehensive picture of Shepard's network without drawing attention to himself. But he also understood that he was now inside the lion's den. If Shepard operated at senior levels, then the people around Bachmann, the officers he reported to, the commanders who reviewed his work, any of them could be part of the conspiracy. Any of them could be watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, ready to silence him as they had silenced others who asked the wrong questions. He worked carefully, methodically, using his official duties as cover for his real investigation. During the day, he prepared the intelligence summaries he was assigned to produce. At night, in his cramped quarters in a requisition department building, he analyzed the evidence he had gathered, compared it against classified reports he was not supposed to access, built profiles of suspects, traced the flow of compromised intelligence from source to enemy action. 3 weeks into his assignment, the dog found him again. Bachmann was walking back to his quarters after a late shift when he heard the familiar sound of claws clicking on cobblestones. He turned, and there it was, the same Belgian Malinois, moving through the darkened streets with that purposeful gait, its eyes reflecting the dim light from blacked-out windows. The dog approached him directly, no hesitation, as if it had been searching specifically for him. Around its collar was another leather pouch. Inside the pouch was a single photograph. The photograph showed 5 men in civilian clothes, standing outside a cafe in what looked like Paris. The image was grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens, but the faces were identifiable. Bachmann recognized 3 of them immediately. One was a colonel who worked in the same building where Bachmann was now stationed, responsible for coordinating intelligence distribution across Allied forces in Western Europe. Another was a lieutenant colonel from British intelligence, someone Bachmann had met briefly during a joint briefing. The third was a civilian, but Bachmann had seen his face in classified files, identified as a liaison officer working with the Free French forces. The other 2 men in the photograph were unfamiliar, but their body language, the way they stood slightly apart from the others, suggested they were the ones in charge of this meeting. One wore expensive clothing that marked him as wealthy, connected, powerful. The other was older, distinguished, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. On the back of the photograph, written in the same awkward English as the journal, was a message: Shepard's Council, meeting monthly, Luxembourg next week, Café Resistance, Rue de la Liberté, will photograph again, terminate or document. Bachmann looked up from the photograph to ask the dog a question, realized the absurdity of trying to communicate with an animal, but found himself speaking anyway. What do you want me to do with this? The dog cocked its head, studying him with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. Then it turned and trotted away, disappearing into an alley before Bachmann could follow. He stood there in the empty street, holding evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single compromised officer, understanding that he was being recruited into something that existed outside all official structures, all legal frameworks, all the rules that soldiers were supposed to follow. Terminate or document. The Belgian operative was asking him to make a choice. Either use this intelligence to build a legal case, working through proper channels, risking that the evidence would be suppressed or the suspects would be warned, or take direct action, eliminate the conspirators, end the threat permanently, and accept the moral and legal consequences of becoming an assassin in the name of a greater good. Bachmann did not sleep that night. He sat in his quarters, staring at the photograph, thinking about Major Pierce's severed finger, about the dozens of dog collars scattered around that hidden camp, about soldiers dying because traitors sold their positions to the enemy. He thought about his oath as a soldier, his duty to follow orders and respect the chain of command. He thought about justice and law, and the principles that supposedly separated Allied forces from the brutality of their enemies. And he thought about what would happen if Shepard's network was not stopped. How many more operations would be compromised? How many more soldiers would die? How long the war would continue because traitors undermined every offensive, every strategic plan, every attempt to achieve victory. By morning, he had made his decision. He would document the conspiracy. He would gather enough evidence to ensure that prosecution would be inevitable, undeniable, impossible to suppress or ignore. But he would not do it alone, and he would not rely on official channels. He would find others like himself, junior officers and enlisted men who had noticed the pattern, who had asked questions and been silenced, who were willing to operate outside the system because the system itself was compromised. And he would use the dogs. He would find the Belgian operative, offer his assistance, combine resources and intelligence to build a case so comprehensive that even Shepard's protectors could not shield them from consequences. But first, he needed to survive the meeting at Café Resistance. He needed to be there when Shepard's council gathered. He needed to see their faces, hear their conversations, understand the full scope of what he was fighting against. The café was located in a quiet street near the old city center, a place that had somehow survived the chaos of occupation and liberation relatively intact. Bachmann arrived 2 hours before the scheduled meeting time. Dressed in civilian clothes he had acquired through black market contacts, carrying forged identification papers that identified him as a Belgian refugee working as a translator for Allied forces. He secured a table near the back, ordered coffee that tasted like charred grain, and waited. Other patrons came and went, mostly military personnel on leave, a few civilians conducting quiet conversations in French and Luxembourgish. The cafe owner was an older woman who moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her eyes revealing nothing about whether she was aware of the meetings that took place in her establishment. The men from the photograph began arriving at dusk. The colonel came first, dressed in civilian clothes that did not quite disguise his military bearing. The British lieutenant colonel followed 10 minutes later, accompanied by the Free French liaison. The two others, the ones Bachmann did not recognize, arrived last, entering through a rear door that suggested they knew the building well. They gathered at a corner table, shielded from direct observation by a wooden partition, speaking in voices too low for Bachmann to hear clearly. He had positioned himself carefully, using the angles of the room to maintain visual contact, while appearing to focus on a newspaper he had brought as a prop. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. Bachmann could not hear most of the conversation, but he observed the body language, the exchanges of documents, the moment when one of the unidentified men passed an envelope to the colonel, who accepted it with the casual ease of someone engaged in a routine transaction. When the meeting concluded, the men departed in the same staggered sequence they had arrived, careful not to leave together, maintaining the fiction that this was simply a coincidental gathering of acquaintances in a public space. Bachmann waited 15 minutes after the last man left before he rose to depart. He had gathered no hard evidence, no recorded conversations, no documents that would prove conspiracy in a court-martial. But he had confirmed that the meeting was real, that Shepard's counsel existed, that the conspiracy was active and ongoing. He stepped out into the street, turned toward his quarters, and found himself facing the barrel of a pistol held by someone standing in the shadows of an adjacent alley. For a moment, Bachmann thought his investigation had been discovered, that Shepard's network had identified him as a threat, and dispatched an assassin to eliminate him as they had eliminated Pierce. His hand moved toward his own weapon, calculating whether he could draw and fire before the other person pulled the trigger. Then, the figure stepped into the light, and Bachmann saw that it was not an assassin. It was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, wearing the practical clothing of someone who lived rough, moved constantly, survived by blending into backgrounds that others did not notice. Her face was lean, marked by exposure and hardship, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, utterly focused. She spoke in accented English, the same awkward phrasing Bachmann had encountered in the journal. "You are the American sergeant, Bachmann. You followed the dog's trail. You read my journal. You came to this meeting even though you knew it could be a trap." Bachmann kept his hands visible, his voice calm. "You're the Belgian operative, the one running the dogs." She lowered the pistol, but did not holster it. "I am Sergeant Elise Marchand, formerly of the Belgian resistance, currently dead according to all official records, presently engaged in activities that have no official sanction or recognition. And you are either the person who will help me destroy Shepard's network, or the person I will have to kill to protect my mission. Which will it be, Sergeant Bachmann?" He looked at her. This woman who had spent years living in the spaces between armies, hunting traitors while the institutions that should have been hunting them remained blind or complicit. He thought about the choice she was offering him, the line she was asking him to cross, the point of no return that accepting her offer would represent. He thought about soldiers dying while officers sold intelligence for money. He thought about the war continuing longer than necessary because traitors undermined every effort to end it. He thought about justice and duty and the terrible weight of acting when the people responsible for action refused to do so. "I'll help you," he said. "Tell me what you need." She studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity, assessing his capability, deciding whether to trust him with secrets that could get them both killed. Then she nodded and gestured for him to follow her into the alley, into the darkness, into a world where wars were fought without uniforms or regulations or any protection beyond the conviction that what they were doing, however illegal or brutal, was necessary. Over the following weeks, Bachmann learned the full scope of Marchand's operation. She had not been working alone. There were others scattered across the theater of operations, mostly civilians who had been recruited by various intelligence services and then abandoned when their usefulness ended or their cover was compromised. They formed a loose network, sharing intelligence, coordinating investigations, operating entirely outside official channels, because those channels had proven themselves worse than useless, actively hostile to efforts to root out traitors in the ranks. The dogs were the key to everything. Marchand had begun training them in 1941, initially as a way to communicate with isolated resistance cells in occupied territory. But she had discovered that the animals could do more than carry messages. They could be taught to recognize specific individuals, to track people through complex urban environments, to identify patterns that humans missed because they were too close to the situation, too trapped in their assumptions about how intelligence networks operated. She had trained them to hunt traitors, to follow suspects, observe their meetings, retrieve evidence from locations too dangerous for human operatives to access. The Belgian Malinois that had found Bachmann twice was named Renier, and he was the best of them, capable of independent operation for days at a time, making decisions about routes and timing that suggested a level of cognitive ability that conventional wisdom insisted dogs did not possess. Bachmann contributed what he could. His position in signals intelligence gave him access to classified reports that Marchand could not obtain through her own channels. He identified additional suspects, traced financial transactions that suggested payment for intelligence, documented the flow of compromised information from Allied headquarters to German response. Together, they built a comprehensive picture of Shepard's network. It was larger than either of them had imagined. The conspiracy included not just individual officers selling intelligence for money, but organized rings coordinating across multiple allied nations, facilitated by civilians who operated legitimate businesses as cover for their intelligence brokering, protected by senior officials who had been compromised through blackmail or ideology or simple corruption. Shepard itself, they discovered, was not a person. It was a designation, a role that rotated among 3 senior intelligence officers who coordinated the network's activities, insulated themselves from direct exposure, and ensured that if one member was compromised, the others could continue operations uninterrupted. Identifying the 3 individuals who currently held Shepard authority required 6 months of investigation, dozens of surveillance operations, analysis of thousands of intercepted communications. But eventually, Marchand and Bachmann succeeded. They knew the names. They knew the meeting locations. They knew the payment mechanisms. They had enough evidence to destroy the network completely. The question remained, what to do with that evidence? Marchand favored direct action. Terminate the 3 Shepard coordinators. Eliminate the key facilitators. Destroy the infrastructure that enabled the network to function. It would be brutal, illegal, impossible to justify in any court-martial or civilian tribunal. But it would be effective. It would end the threat immediately, save countless lives, allow Allied forces to operate without the constant hemorrhaging of intelligence that undermined every strategic initiative. Bachmann wanted to try official channels one more time. Present the evidence to senior commanders who were demonstrably not part of the conspiracy. Force a reckoning. Use the legal mechanisms that existed to bring traitors to justice. It would be slower, more uncertain, vulnerable to suppression or compromise. But it would be legitimate. It would uphold the principles that supposedly distinguished Allied forces from their enemies. They argued about it for weeks, neither willing to concede, both understanding that the choice they made would define not just the outcome of their investigation, but their own moral standing, their own understanding of what they were fighting for and what lines they were willing to cross in that fight. The decision was made for them when Renier returned from a surveillance mission carrying evidence that changed everything. The dog had been tracking one of the Shepard coordinators, a British colonel named Westbrook who operated out of an intelligence facility in Paris. Renier had somehow gained access to Westbrook's private office, had retrieved documents from a safe that should have been secure, had carried those documents across 100 miles of contested territory to deliver them to Marchand. The documents revealed that Shepard was not simply selling intelligence to the Germans. They were also planning to sell it to the Soviets after the war ended, positioning themselves to profit from the inevitable tensions between former allies, ensuring that the network would continue operating regardless of which political system prevailed in post-war Europe. More horrifying still, the documents included plans for assassinations, not of military personnel but of political figures, journalists, investigators who might expose the conspiracy after hostilities ceased. Shepard was preparing to defend itself with murder, to ensure that the people who profited from war would continue profiting from peace. Bachmann read the documents in Marchand's safe house, his hands shaking, understanding that he had been naive to think this could be resolved through official channels. The conspiracy was too large, too well protected, too deeply embedded in the structures that were supposed to prevent such corruption. He looked at Marchand, saw in her eyes that she already knew what his answer would be, that she had been waiting for him to reach this conclusion on his own, rather than forcing him to accept it prematurely. "Tell me what needs to be done," he said. She laid out the plan. 3 simultaneous operations, targeting the 3 Shepard coordinators, timed to occur during a period when Allied command would be focused on a major offensive, when the deaths could be attributed to enemy action or explained as accidents in the chaos of war. It would require perfect coordination, absolute secrecy, and a willingness to accept that they would never receive recognition for what they had done, that if they succeeded, the world would never know how many lives they had saved, and if they failed, they would be executed as traitors themselves. Bachmann agreed to everything. He used his position to gather intelligence on the coordinators' movements, their security details, their vulnerabilities. Marchand recruited additional operatives, civilians, and soldiers who had been similarly disillusioned by the failure of official institutions to address treason in the ranks. The operations took place over 3 days in April of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany and the end of the war became inevitable. Colonel Westbrook was killed when his staff car struck a mine on a road that had been cleared just hours earlier. An American colonel named Sutherland was shot by what appeared to be a German sniper during a frontline inspection tour. A French intelligence official named Beaumont died in a fire that consumed his apartment building, tragic but unremarkable given the chaos of liberated Paris. Each death was investigated. Each investigation concluded that the fatalities were unfortunate casualties of war. Nothing suspicious. No evidence of foul play. The investigations did not examine the precise timing of the deaths, did not notice that key facilitators of Shepard's network disappeared or died in accidents during the same period, did not recognize that an entire intelligence conspiracy had been systematically dismantled by a handful of operatives who had no official authorization and left no documentary trail. Marchand and Bachmann separated after the operations concluded. She returned to the shadows, continuing her work with the dogs, hunting other threats that official institutions refused to acknowledge. He resumed his official duties, carrying secrets that would never appear in any report, knowing that he had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. They met one final time, 6 weeks after Germany surrendered. Renier was there, older now, scarred from battles that left no record, but still alert, still capable, still carrying messages between people who operated in worlds that official histories would never document. Marchand gave Bachmann a final piece of intelligence. The network had not been completely destroyed. Some facilitators remained active. Some payment mechanisms still functioned. Some compromised officers had avoided identification. Shepard, as an organization, was broken, but the impulse it represented, the willingness to profit from betrayal, would resurface in new forms, under new names, as long as wars created opportunities for those willing to sell their loyalty. She told him to stay vigilant, to remember what he had learned, to understand that the real war was not between nations or ideologies, but between those who honored their obligations and those who saw only opportunities for exploitation. Then she and Renier walked away, disappearing into the crowds of celebrating soldiers and civilians, becoming ghosts again, returning to a parallel existence where wars continued long after victory parades ended. Bachmann never saw her again. He returned to the United States, completed his military service, spent decades working in intelligence communities where he watched for signs that the patterns he had learned to recognize were re-emerging, that new networks were forming to replace the ones he had helped destroy. He kept Marchand's final message with him always, a reminder written on a scrap of paper in that distinctive awkward English: trust what cannot lie. Trust what serves without question. Trust the dogs. They see truth we are too compromised to recognize. Years later, long after official secrecy periods expired, historians examining wartime intelligence failures would note anomalies they could not explain, operations that should have been compromised but somehow succeeded, German intelligence networks that mysteriously collapsed at critical moments, Allied officers who died in accidents that statistical analysis suggested were improbably concentrated in time and space. The official investigations never found answers. The documents had been destroyed or had never existed. The witnesses were dead, or had vanished, or claimed no memory of events that should have been unforgettable. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, soldiers who had served in those final months of the war would tell stories about a Belgian Malinois that appeared when least expected, carrying messages no official courier would touch, delivering evidence of betrayals that no formal investigation would acknowledge, serving masters whose names appeared in no military registry and whose missions left no trace beyond the lives they saved and the traitors they eliminated. Those stories were dismissed as legend, as the kind of mythology that grows around all wars, as soldiers trying to make sense of chaos by inventing narratives of hidden guardians and secret justice. But Bachmann knew the truth, and on quiet mornings, when the sun rose cold over whatever city he lived in during those long post-war decades, he would sometimes see a dog in the distance, lean and purposeful, watching him with eyes that seemed to understand everything, to remember everything, to know that some battles never end, that some wars continue in silence, that some victories must remain forever unacknowledged. And he would remember Elise Marchand and Renier and all the others who fought in shadows, who chose duty over law when law failed to serve justice, who became what they hunted because no one else was willing to hunt at all. The shepherd has a shepherd, Pierce had written in his final message. Find the Belgian. Trust the Belgian. It knows more than we do. Bachmann had found the Belgian. He had learned to trust not just Marchand, but the principle she represented, the understanding that righteousness sometimes required operating outside every official structure, every legal framework, every comfortable fiction about how justice was supposed to function. He had learned that dogs could see what humans refused to acknowledge, could serve missions that required absolute loyalty, uncorrupted by ideology or greed or fear, could deliver truth when every human system was compromised by the very flaws those systems were designed to prevent. And he had learned, in those final months of war and the long decades that followed, that the greatest battles are fought by those whose names appear in no history, whose sacrifices receive no recognition, whose victories consist simply of preventing horrors that the world will never know were possible. The sun rises every morning over lands that were once battlefields. People live their lives unaware of the prices paid for their peace. And sometimes, in the moments before dawn, a dog appears on a snowy trail, carrying messages between shadows, completing missions that began before anyone living was born, and will continue long after they are gone. This is not legend. This is not mythology. This is truth, witnessed by those who chose to see, remembered by those who refuse to forget, continued by those who understand that some wars never end, they only change form, and the vigilance required to prevent their resurgence is eternal. May God grant wisdom to recognize when duty demands action that authority refuses to authorize. May Jesus Christ guide those who must walk through darkness to protect those who live in light. And may we never forget that sometimes salvation comes not from institutions or leaders, but from the loyalty of creatures who serve without question, who carry truth without corruption, who remind us that honor exists not in titles or ranks or official recognition, but in the simple act of completing the mission, regardless of cost, regardless of acknowledgement, regardless of whether anyone will ever know what was done in their name. The dog's name was Renier. Remember that name. Remember what it represented. Remember that truth sometimes arrives at dawn, carried in the jaws of a creature that cannot lie, revealing betrayals that power protects and justice demands be exposed. Remember, stay vigilant. Trust the Belgian. The mission continues.